So we've started right out with talking about decentralization and kind of basically what are the general frameworks for thinking about that, how do you kind of set that up, right? Then we talked about tokens, how to launch a token, right, and using tokens as a tool to kind of achieve further decentralization. And today we'll talk about kind of the practical reality of basically how you set up kind of your business structure in order to kind of further enhance decentralization. As we've talked about, decentralization is not a a pretty binary event, right? It is a spectrum, and we talked about a bit about progressive decentralization and how kind of you kind of can become decentralized more over time, right? And so corporate structure is kind of a very important part of that because it ultimately is kind of the basis from which you set up different actors to act within the ecosystem. And so you can really either undermine decentralization by not setting up the proper corporate structure, or you can facilitate it further. There are a lot of pitfalls in this because this is fairly new. And so as a result of that, there are kind of, it is not fully ironed out yet and perfect, but we'll kind of walk you through generally where the thinking is here. And then Porter's conversation later on governance will be a really good kind of then layer on top of this because it'll show you basically how governance kind of interacts with the corporate structure that you put in place. So we're going to talk about fundamentals, we're going to talk about DAOs, we're going to talk about foundations, and then we're going to show how that kind of all fits together. So the fundamentals. So if you're building a startup, most of you already have a company that you've created, and usually what entity form that people use when they're building startups are C Corps. So if you were not decentralizing, kind of that's really all you need to know in building your company for what kind of corporate structure you want to use. C Corps have been around for a really long time. They provide limited liability, which means that stockholders in a C Corp are not liable for the actions of the company other than in kind of a very small set of circumstances. And that's really important, right? Because that helps you raise capital and it protects the shareholders that have invested money from the kind of risks that the company takes on. And so as a result of that, that has kind of been a very significant boon in entrepreneurship in the United States. Corporations are also a separate and distinct tax entity, and so what that means is that when a corporation kind of earns profits, right, they have to pay taxes on that, and then if they distribute it to stockholders, there is then a second layer of tax. So they're not the most tax efficient vehicle in the world, but again, for every kind of startup in the U.S. And through companies that IPO, almost everyone uses C Corps. The next kind of entity form are LLCs and partnerships. And so what these give you a lot more flexibility in kind of how you're set up. LLCs also offer limited liability. And typically you'll see these used with really kind of like small and closely held companies. They're not used that often in the context of startups because generally there's kind of rules for VCs and what kind of entity forms that they can invest in. So it hasn't been a common structure within the VC world. So you don't see it that often with startups, but you do see it kind of occasionally. Partnerships are typically used by law firms, accounting firms, and other entities like that. They don't have limited liability protection, so they're not very good for kind of companies that are engaged in more kind of risky areas. And then finally, you have unincorporated associations, and this is a very kind of unknown and entity form that most people have never come into contact with, most lawyers have never come into contact with, but it is an entity form that is starting to become more relevant. It exists under common law in a lot of different states and exists under statute in several states. And so we're starting to explore this entity form more, and I'll kind of come back to why this is going to be important later on in the presentation. So within a decentralized ecosystem, right, you're going to have basically typically start out with three different components. You're going to have your developer corporation, right? So that's the startup that you're using to kind of build your ecosystem, right? The developer corporation, typically kind of continues on existing after the decentralization event. So let's say token launch and the launching of a DAO, but its role in the environment, definitely changes. As I talked about yesterday, right? Communication really matters post token launch, and so the developer corporation goes from being the leader of an ecosystem to just being kind of one member of that ecosystem and having the initial development team. But obviously, right, if you're setting up any environment where you are kind of creating a situation where the developer corporation is fundamental to the kind of success of an ecosystem, right, you're obviously going to have problems from a decentralization perspective. Yesterday we talked about legal decentralization and the concepts that you need to kind of eliminate, the potential for significant information asymmetries and for, reliance on managerial efforts, right? And so if you have a developer corporation that is absolutely critical to the, to the development of an ecosystem, then it's hard to say that you actually do have legal decentralization. One way to kind of think about this, right, and just to give a real world example, is if you think about consensus as compared to Ethereum. It is a good example of a developer corporation that is, still involved within the Ethereum ecosystem. They have, significant applications that everyone uses, MetaMask, for instance, right? But at the same time, no one would really argue that the success of Ethereum is dependent on consensus. And as a result of that, they've done a very good job of kind of creating a meaningful participant within the ecosystem that doesn't undermine the overall decentralization of Ethereum. The next kind of entity is a foundation. And so these are entities, really they started being used by, layer 1 protocols pretty early on. There's the Ethereum Foundation and several others. Maker had a foundation. And really what these entities are meant to do, right, is they're ownerless, so they don't have shareholders, therefore they don't have a goal of kind of maximizing value for their own shareholders. And you can set their basic, agenda, what their mission is. And so in a lot of instances, that'll be essentially you want the mission to be to grow the ecosystem and support developers within it. And then, there's been a bunch of different kind of pathways that people have explored with foundations to, increase their overall importance to ecosystems. And we've seen some kind of friction and struggles there, so we'll get into that later as well. And then finally, you have DAOs. DAOs are, something that I think really kind of came onto the scene very strongly in 2021. There was a lot of hype around them. People got very excited, and then that was followed by, I think, some despondency over the fact that they were very difficult to manage. I think people's expectations got a little bit ahead of what DAOs were actually capable of, and so people are now kind of right-sizing it, and a lot of that will have to do with kind of the governance stuff that Porter will talk about in his presentation. All right, so let's talk about DAOs. So if we think about kind of the necessity for DAOs, right, we can say that when you're dealing with a decentralized protocol, right, the reason that you want a DAO is that you want some entity, some organization to be responsible for a couple different things, right? You want to know that they're going to kind of oversee the kind of further development of the protocol. For certain DeFi protocols, right, you have parameters that need to be adjusted. And so you want some ability to kind of adjust these protocols over time. And if you were to retain control, as the developer corporation, then you would, be undermining the overall decentralization, and it would look like that, the kind of whole community, token prices, right, were reliant on you continuing to manage the protocol. So the idea behind governance tokens was essentially to hand control of the protocol over to, token holders, right? And so that is a very powerful kind of opportunity to increase the overall decentralization, but it also enhances the credible neutrality of the protocol, because it means that, again, the network isn't being controlled by a single developer corporation. And so, generally speaking, right, DAOs in that context and what they, what they're meant to achieve is pretty rational and reasonable. And it's really kind of, I think, what we'll go into, right, is that the struggles with this entity form have been kind of really have kind of come out of the idea that people expect far too much of them. So there's a lot of different kinds of DAOs, right? The first DAOs were really set up. I think that the first one was kind of set up with respect to on Ethereum. It was called the DAO, and basically what it was set up was as an investment DAO where a bunch of people put their money in, and then they were going to manage it. But really what we're going to focus on today is protocol DAOs, right? So these are the governance organizations that basically oversee decentralized protocols. So that can be layer 1, or it can be a smart contract protocol like Uniswap, or it could be layer 2 like Optimism. And so, there in Compound, MakerDAO, these are all kind of DAOs that we are going to focus on today because they're the critical pieces for the decentralization. So other DAOs that have popped up, right, there are now a lot of social DAOs, and so, you see FWB, Links DAO, right, basically it's a bunch of people that come together and use a token to kind of organize their activities. And then we have investment DAOs, as I was saying, that this was kind of the first DAO, which was formed around, investment opportunities. There are protocols like Syndicate that help people launch investment clubs, and really, investment DAOs are basically, this really became, I think, popular with respect to NFT investing, and so you had a lot of people that were pooling their money together and then making joint investments in NFTs. And then there are collective DAOs. So there are groups of individuals that come together to provide certain services within the Web3 ecosystem. So you have a lot of DAOs that are set up to be a bunch of developers, and they basically go around to other DAOs and fulfill kind of requests for different pieces of smart contracts to be developed, and so they basically kind of act in that way. Now the thing that I would say, right, is that social DAOs, investment DAOs, and collective DAOs really all kind of reflect real world businesses that already exist, right? We already have social clubs, we already have investment firms, we already have collectives, right? And so as a result of that, the entity forms for those types of structures is fairly straightforward. We have analogs in kind of the everyday business world for those. And so as a result of those, there's not kind of as much consternation around kind of what you're actually supposed to do on the entity form basis. Protocol DAOs, on the other hand, are very different, right? You don't look like a company. As we talked about yesterday, protocols are not companies. Token holders are not shareholders. And token holders have limited voting rights. And so as a result of that, right, protocol DAOs don't really have a good entity form to use. And so historically, people haven't used an entity form, and that's created a lot of kind of issues within the space that we'll get into more. So focusing on protocol DAOs, basically, how do you have one of these set up, right? Well, what happens is that the developer corporation basically sets up their protocol, right? So let's say they're launching a layer 1 or launching a smart contract to, or deploying a smart contract protocol to a layer 1. Essentially what happens as you approach the token launch stage, right, you basically set up you launch a governance protocol. And so you deploy that on chain, and that would be, the most common one that's used is Compounds, which is Governor Bravo. And that basically is just a series of smart contracts that enables basically hands control over the smart contracts of the underlying protocol to the governance smart contracts. And as a result of that, once you launch your token, right, the token holders now have the control that whatever the developer corporation originally had with respect to the underlying smart contract protocol. So as a result of that, you can see, right, all of a sudden we're reducing the overall reliance on managerial efforts because we are pushing, any decision making with respect to the smart contract protocol onto a now decentralized group of holders of tokens. And so, that again increases the overall credible neutrality of the protocol and turns the protocol to look more like, public infrastructure than it does like a corporate network that is, controlled and operated by one monolithic company. So what we talked about yesterday, right, this is another slide from the decentralization presentation, right, is that essentially the way to think about this is that the DAO, right, is going to oversee the smart contract protocol. But if we have a bunch of clients and applications that are built on top of that smart contract protocol, all of those will continue to be centralized businesses that are operated by C Corps. So if you are, headed in this direction, what you would, and we talked about the NFT marketplace example yesterday and OpenSea, right? If OpenSea was to head in this direction with a C-Port, for instance, one of the things they could do is they could continue to operate their marketplace through the C Corp that they already have in place. Other C Corps could form and then launch their own marketplaces as alternate clients, and then all of them would collectively kind of participate in the decentralized governance of the underlying smart contract protocol. And so as a result of that, right, you have kind of a multi-tiered structure. One of the kind of criticisms that people have made about DAOs, right, is that it's kind of a negative for employees and people that are working for these organizations because DAOs, again, don't have a legal entity form, and so there's all these problems arise around kind of workers' rights and things like that. But fundamentally, I think that the way that we view it, right, is that DAOs are really kind of a component of the software. And you don't want to, you're not trying to build Google within a DAO. What you're trying to do is create a fairly lean organization that oversees the governance of the smart contract protocol, but doesn't actually kind of, it doesn't actually have a giant engineering team that is then building out pieces. All of that just kind of undermines the general decentralization. And so what we want to see, right, is a very lean kind of entity structure that sits across the smart contract protocol, but then you have C corps and normal, entity forms that are above that are ones that are actually running the business on top of the internet infrastructure. So legal implications here. Now, one of the things that comes up in the context of this, right, is, okay, well, why do we need legal entity forms at all for DAOs, right? And I think, like, how is it any different from, let's say, email, for instance? Email is a very, famous and well-used Web 1 protocol, and email doesn't have a legal wrapper, right? There's no legal entity or DAO associated with email. The difference is, right, is that with respect to when we enter into Web 3, right, DAOs and smart contract protocols have a significant difference from Web 1 protocols, in that Web 3 protocols, right, they do have the ability to generate income. No one pays fees for using email, so there's no revenue that's accruing to some email DAO. They can use decentralized governance to administer the affairs of the DAO, right? So they can change parameters to the extent necessary, or they can opt to deploy to new chains, or they can opt to adopt new smart contracts to upgrade the protocol. As a result of that, you have a much more dynamic protocol than what you have in Web 1, where if you wanted to change the email protocol, you'd have to be, if you were like Google, you would just start doing something differently and then hope everyone kind of followed you. And so as a result of that, like the fact that you have a bunch of people coming together and participating in decentralized governance and making decisions about the underlying protocol increases the need for limited liability protection, right? Because you don't ultimately want token holders to be responsible for losses just because they participated in decentralized governance. We want the same protections that C corps already have, but that don't have without a proper entity form for the DAO. And then finally, one of the very common practices is for DAOs to be awarded kind of a significant treasury that they can then allocate to continue development of the ecosystem, to just foster a more rich developer community to work on public goods and all sorts of stuff. So fundamentally, right, where we see DAOs is that they're this hybrid between a company and just software. And as a result of that, it's kind of brand new, and it does need a legal entity form because there have been some serious issues that have arisen. So here are the key issues when it comes to DAOs, right? They don't have legal existence. And if you don't have legal existence, that means that you can't enter into contracts with someone. It means that you can't file tax returns, right? So DAOs don't have any ability to pay taxes, even if they're earning income. And then, as I was saying, they have potential unlimited liability. So you can imagine, right, if you were a DAO for a smart contract protocol that let's say got hacked, and all of a sudden some people lost money, right? As token holders, you wouldn't be responsible for that type of loss if you were the shareholder of the corporation. And so if you're the token, and I know we've talked about kind of tokens not being a proxy for equity, but at the end of the day, right, you shouldn't have liability just because you hold a token that votes on the various parameters of an underlying smart contract protocol. If there was no limited liability protection, right, it would make ownership of tokens extremely unattractive, and as a result of that, it would jeopardize the capability of decentralized governance to actually function, right? If no one wants to participate in decentralized governance because there's potential liability associated with it, then no one's going to, and as a result of that, we won't be able to kind of make use of DAOs as good tools. So these issues are not theoretical. It has been fairly frustrating to watch over the course of the last 2 years, but we're seeing more and more class action lawsuits being brought against DAOs for various types of activities, even where DAOs haven't issued tokens, but a foundation or corporation has. We're seeing DAOs get kind of pulled into to litigation. And most recently, we've seen patent infringement lawsuits brought against MakerDAO and against Compound. And this is really kind of frustrating, right? Because what we're seeing and what happens with patent trolls, right, is they basically, they're running a business, and what they want to do is they want to be able to make money by flexing on organizations to basically settle with them. And as a result of that, they're kind of testing out whether or not DAOs are an attractive target. And what they're finding, right, is that, well, it is very complicated for DAOs to respond, right? Again, without limited liability, there's significant kind of concern that that token holders are going to be exposed to potential losses arising out of patent infringement, no matter how spurious the claims are. And then also you have this inherent problem where DAO members don't want to step up to protect the DAO, because then it kind of undermines the overall idea that people are not reliant on anyone else's managerial efforts, right? So we're finding it very, very challenging to actually respond to cases and to actually step in and help defend DAOs. And so as a result of that, right, the complications are only going to get worse in my mind. There's going to continue to be more and more class actions brought against them. So if this isn't a problem that we solve, it's going to make token ownership and participation in decentralized governance a lot more unattractive. Another kind of case that's been brought that is also kind of really critical in this area is one against Oki DAO that was brought by the CFTC. And there, for the first time, it's being litigated in California, but we're starting to see kind of the ideas around, well, if you don't have a legal entity form, what are the courts going to basically assign as a legal entity form to you? And generally, I think that a good rule of thumb is that they're going to assign the legal entity that is worse for you, right? And so as a result of that, not having a legal entity in place is exposing you to a lot of risk. All right, so as a result of that, right, one of the things that people have started to do is they've tried to take the foundation structure that was popularized with respect to both Ethereum, MakerDAO, right, use these foundations early on, and people have started to try and use foundations to solve these problems, right? So as a result of like the most common structures that we see right now are foundations being set up as basically like ecosystem funds to fund award grants to developers within the ecosystem to have them develop things for the protocol. They're also being used for legal defense, right, to step into the shoes of the DAO. And then, for community management, right, basically organizing people and the proposals that come forward, ensuring, they go through snapshot voting, testing the waters, and then kind of coming into full on-chain voting. And then, they're also in some instances kind of engaged in ongoing development or just coordinating, external developers. But this has also led to a lot of problems, right? At the end of the day, wherever you have kind of a crossover between the digital world and the real world, right, you then have to start having kind of components that exist in the real world. And when it comes to foundations, right, that means that you have an actual board of directors of the foundation, and those are real people that have to be kind of associated with that foundation. So that introduces trust, right? Whenever you're kind of reliant on humans, you now, no longer have a trustless environment. And so one of the, problems that we've seen with respect to foundations is that people have, and DAOs have been, not kind of thrilled about the idea of foundations kind of receiving massive amounts of tokens in the form of a treasury. If you watched kind of the Arbitrum situation play out, one of the things that a lot of the DAO members were upset about at the outset, right, was the fact that a significant kind of treasury award was granted to the foundation to basically spend that on further development for the ecosystem. But the board of directors of the foundation had no requirement to answer to DAO members. And so as a result of that, I think a lot of people in the Arbitrum community kind of thought that this wasn't very decentralized because they were setting up this kind of monolithic foundation that was going to be responsible for all of the grant awards, and the DAO would have preferred that they had some say in that. Now, at the end of the day, I think the way that Arbitrum actually set it up is the correct way. Maybe they didn't need to give such a large grant size to the foundation. But fundamentally, one of the problems that people have wanted to solve with foundations, right, is basically make the foundation the real world arm of the DAO. But there's inherent problems with that, right? So if you were able to successfully do that, let's say that every time the DAO wanted to do something, they just basically told the foundation to do it, and then the foundation did it, right? Now, conceptually, people think that might actually afford you then limited liability because now the now the foundation is acting and not the actual DAO. But in reality, we don't really think that that's going to work out very well because fundamentally the DAO is still kind of acting and is a separate actor. And so we're not sure that we are actually going to get limited liability protection out of that. It also introduces a lot of kind of weird scenarios where if a DAO is controlling a foundation, controlling the board of directors of a foundation, it starts to look more like a C corp and starts to look more like a traditional entity structure. And so it's kind of unknown whether or not ultimately that kind of undoes some of the decentralization that protocols are shooting for. Now, these foundations are often set up, in foreign jurisdictions, most common Cayman Islands and BVI, which can be tax favorable. But at the same time, if you have a foundation that is set up in, a foreign jurisdiction, but it's actually just controlled by a bunch of Americans, there's a degree of likelihood that the U.S. will just pierce that structure and not respect it. And as a result, you don't actually get the tax benefits that you're shooting for. So again, that's a better reason why, a foundation should be controlled by its own board and not actually controlled by the DAO members, because if the DAO members control it, you can kind of increase your overall U.S. nexus if the DAO members are, mostly in the United States. Finally, I think, one of the things that I think a lot about when setting up these structures is that the legitimacy of setting up offshore structures versus, onshore in the United States, I think is an important point. Obviously, with kind of entities like FTX and Binance and Terra, coming under scrutiny by the government, all of these entities were foreign, and I think that the general level of scrutiny and skepticism that U.S. regulators show towards foreign entities is higher than U.S. entities, although in the SEC's case, they do seem to be targeting U.S. companies over foreign companies, which is one reason to try and go offshore. Okay, so putting it all together, right? It seems like there's no great solution, and that this is all kind of a bit of a dumpster fire. And it is, it is a work in progress, but we are making progress, and so there are things that are improving. So we'll now kind of just walk you through how we basically come to a structure that is defensible and that can help achieve the goals of decentralization. So this text is pretty small here, but one of the things that we've worked a lot on here is coming up with a legal entity to wrap a DAO, right? And the idea there is that the DAO then kind of uses this entity to get limited liability, to have some touch point with the real world, enable it to pay taxes, right? But at the same time then doesn't undermine the decentralization. The entity form that looks like, or the one that we are kind of angling towards, is a unincorporated nonprofit association. So at the outset, we talked about unincorporated associations, and the unincorporated nonprofit association is a entity form that exists in several states. Now, one of the two drawbacks that people have with it so far, right, are that A, it hasn't been commonly used historically for any entities, and it hasn't specifically been used for many DAOs, although there are some DAOs that have used it. And then the second is the nonprofit piece, right? Now, when we talk about nonprofit, it doesn't mean that you can't engage in for-profit activity. All it really means is that you can't dividend out your profits to token holders as though they were shareholders. But as we talked about yesterday, right, during the token presentation, the way that you should be designing the mechanisms for your tokens is to move away from kind of equity-like distributions, right? And instead of that, you should be incentivizing people to actually participate in your ecosystems and paying them for that. And that type of activity is perfectly acceptable within UNA structures. So as long as you're kind of bought in on the stakeholder capitalism idea, the nonprofit status of these UNAs is actually not kind of problematic. Now, so I think that the second challenge is really one that we've kind of solved, right? The first one is one that we're on the verge of solving within, I think it's actually going to be tomorrow, but we are going to be announcing that California has a bill in place for DAOs to use UNAs in California. We're working with several other states to put bills in place. So I think hopefully by the time that this CSS is done, there actually will be a legal entity form, and this component of the problem will be solved. So this is something that I've been working on for about 2 years now, which is painstaking in terms of how long it takes to get anything done, but we are almost there. The finish line is in sight. Okay, so that solves the DAO issue, right? If we get a legal entity form there, then we have protection from limited liability. That means that people will not be disincentivized from participating in decentralized governance, which means that becomes a more viable pathway to to overseeing a protocol over time. Okay, so now foundations, right? I think if we have the limited liability, now we can start to move away from using foundations to try and protect you from limited liability. So you can move away from trying to have the foundation just be controlled by the DAO, and instead you can set up a foundation to really kind of further enhance the decentralization of an ecosystem. So how do you do that? Well, you start with strong mission alignment, right? So you basically make sure that the core mission of the foundation, right, that cannot be changed, is to grow the ecosystem and do whatever your mission for the ecosystem is, right? So you basically kind of make it and set it in stone that they are mission aligned. You make it actually independent, right? So that the key independence there is going to be independence from the actual developer corporation, right? So your CEO of your dev corp shouldn't also be on the board of your foundation. There inherently is a conflict there in terms of whose interests are being represented, and it kind of undermines the decentralization. So you want to find people that will sit on the board of the foundation and will actually kind of go about carrying out its mission. You then want to transfer intellectual property to the foundation. The foundation is going to be the real world kind of representative of the ecosystem, right? Not acting on behalf of the DAO, but by giving it the intellectual property, you give it the ability to defend the intellectual property. So now obviously most stuff in Web3 is going to be open source, but there's other stuff like trademarks, right? And so if you want your foundation to make sure that someone isn't branding themselves as, Uniswap's front end, right? The foundation would be the tool to kind of do that. Personnel, right? As I was saying earlier, these foundations should not be built out, or like neither DAOs or foundations should be built out like Google. They should not have hundreds of engineers that are kind of churning out, development work for the protocol, because ultimately, if you've done that, all you've done is move the monolithic entity that controls the ecosystem from your developer corporation to the foundation, right? You ultimately don't want anyone that's controlling it. The foundation is just another player in the ecosystem that offsets some of the power of the dev corp, and then is balanced with the DAO itself. And then you have the treasury, right? So you need to be able to fund the foundation so that it can carry out its mission, right? And so one of the ways that you can do that is basically granting tokens to it and giving it some cash to get started. The foundation can then sell tokens outside the United States over time to fund its operations. And one of the things that people might want to do is basically unlock those tokens over time, so that the foundation can't just sell hundreds of millions of dollars worth of tokens day one and kind of mess up the overall ecosystem. So if you following these kind of structures, you can put a foundation in place that's going to be ultimately increase the overall decentralization of the system. And again, you should always be looking at the foundation as kind of a tool to help achieving greater decentralization, not as a replacement for the developer corporation. So looking at this, we can see how you can basically grow from the start, right? So you have a DevCo, launches the DAO and the foundation, right? The DAO controls the protocol upgrades, the parameters, and any changes to the protocol, use of the protocol treasury, right? The foundation is granted a portion of tokens. It then administers grants to developers to develop within the ecosystem, and then maybe some of those grants go to the DevCo to continue developing pieces for the protocol, right? Now, just talking about this like logically, right? You can see yesterday we talked during the decentralization presentation and the token presentation, we talked a lot about how post-decentralization, post-token launch, right, development is very hard. It's inefficient, right? It costs more, and it's slow. And you can see why, right? All of a sudden, right, you're now moving kind of people to different entity forms. You're basically having to get approvals by the DAO in order to upgrade certain smart contracts. So all of it, right, you're just layering in a ton of friction to actually, changing things and moving things forward. Now, again, that is the downside of pursuing decentralized development. Ultimately, I think anyone that is pursuing decentralization should feel very confident in the idea that, that is a better ultimate outcome than, running a dictatorship of a centralized business, and that you'll be able to, ultimately grow your ecosystem bigger this way. But at the outset, there is a lot of friction and it is very difficult. So people should not be optimistic about kind of what they'll be able to get done post decentralization. And that's why one of the things that we talked a lot about yesterday in those other presentations is finding product market fit and making sure that you've kind of built out everything that you need to build out for your protocol to be able to survive for quite a while. So you grow from there to there, right? So in this one, you basically kind of can see how you incentivize other operators and companies to come into the ecosystem. Maybe the foundation grants to a developer corporation to develop new smart contract protocols. If you're doing a layer one, right, the foundation could be the tool that you use to basically incentivize developers to deploy DeFi protocols to your layer, right? And ultimately what you're trying to do is basically bring as many people into the ecosystem as possible so that the overall reliance on the developer corporation and the foundation goes down. So you can create new grant programs that are run by independent people. You can bring, incentivize developers to come in, and overall what you're just trying to do is, again, increase the number of people, create redundancy, reduce the overall reliance on the devco. So one of the things that's really kind of important about this, right, is making sure when you are approaching the token launch that you're setting yourself up to increase decentralization over time after the token launch. We showed in the progressive decentralization slides, right, we showed that if you don't do progressive decentralization well, right, growth will slow and your ability to develop will slow and you'll end up in stagnation. Whereas if you do it correctly, right, you'll have the proper tools and incentives in place to basically bring more developers into the ecosystem, which will increase growth and increase development pace over time, and that will then further help decentralization. So it's kind of a virtuous circle, right? So ways that you can do that and ways that you can set up your protocol to increase in decentralization over time post-token launch, right, is by kind of building these things ahead of time to facilitate greater decentralization. So prioritizing interoperability, right? You want to make everything permissionless and composable as possible so that you can maximize the ability of other people to use the infrastructure that you've created. You want to incentivize decentralization, as we talked about, right? Incentivizing front ends to basically operate on top of your protocol is a way to make sure that people can build businesses on top of your infrastructure. And that is the only way to really ensure that people are going to do that. Ultimately, grant programs are great to kind of jumpstart an ecosystem, but long term, the incentives need to be in place for them to automatically be able to make money building on top of your infrastructure. If they don't have that, right, once the grant program's done, they're going to walk away and go do something else. So you need to kind of have a continuous business model that they can plug into. Third, you want to promote transparency, right? So everything about the ecosystem should be basically done in the open, right? So if you have people that are coordinating, different things that they're building, you want that to be talked about in Discords and in other public channels, right? One of the things that we've seen a lot of is in requests for proposals, right? With respect to vendors that are providing services. One of the things that we're seeing a lot of, right, is people deploying, DeFi protocols from Ethereum to other chains. And you can see the practices that work really well, right, which are usually requests for proposals where you get a bunch of different interchain operators to come in and propose how they're going to deploy those DeFi protocols to other systems, versus, right, someone just coming in and saying, hey, you should use me, and without any request for proposal, and just putting forth that they carry the day. As a result, within decentralized governance, and Porter will talk a lot about this, right? There are better practices that you can use to ensure that there is transparency, and where there isn't transparency, there's always a lot of friction around and distrust around what's going on with DAOs. And so as a result of that, you really want to set things up to ensure, have a request for proposal process built into your governance process, right? You want to have these things set up so that you can ensure that there's going to be greater decentralization and transparency over time. Lower the barriers to people kind of participating in decentralized governance. One of the things that you can do, if you know that there are potential upgrades that the protocol is going to need in the future, you can create kind of the governance proposals for those ahead of time, have a library of those available for people to then be able to just use if they want to make a proposal to the DAO. And then enable broad use of IP. Right? You ultimately want people to kind of be able to build on top of what you're using and to recreate it. Then you want to ensure that your community is well suited for decentralization. So a lot of founders and a lot of companies in the space, right? They, as we talked about, they engage in a lot of decentralization theater in the sense that they know that they have to be decentralized in order to use digital assets. But they don't really want to decentralize and they want to get to the token quickly, and so they launch the token before they're really ready to have a full decentralized protocol that's going to stand up on its own 2 feet. And so as a result of that, right, they then kind of come in and they refer to themselves as the core development team, and they basically kind of work on whatever they want to, and then just kind of jam it through the DAO and vote it through. All of that is kind of really undermines the overall decentralization, obviously, and is one of the reasons why I think regulators are quite skeptical of decentralization overall, because there are just kind of numerous examples of people that are playing a little bit of a game here and not really decentralizing. So like I cannot be say strongly enough, right? You really want to instill kind of the idea of decentralization at the very base level for everyone in your community, and that is what you're gearing towards. You do not want people to be expecting and relying on your continued efforts to drive the success of the ecosystem. You want them to be focused on kind of the DAO itself and the decentralization and the things that it's working on. So, another thing you can do there, right, is have a history of on-chain activity rather than off-chain activity, right? So I think one of the defaults that a lot of people go to is they don't really set their governance up, set it up as and have it as far along as it should be at the time that they launch their token. And one of the problems that results from that, right, is that, like, look, on-chain governance is harder than off-chain governance, but it's also more transparent and it allows all token holders to vote. And so if you don't do the on-chain, token, like if you just cut the corner of going and leaving kind of all governance decisions to off-chain, you're just inherently less decentralized, and it's just kind of, you're starting like the culture in a way that makes it just feel a little bit more shadowy and less transparent. I'll talk about a few more of these. So community leadership, right? You also want to be able to basically set up, people within the DAO that are going to help drive efforts. So one of the biggest, issues that we see, right, is just coordination with respect to proposals that come forward. And so you want to make sure that there are real world actors whose job it is to basically, help people kind of shepherd proposals through the governance process. Foundations are really good for that. Because they do, they can have people that work at them. Uniswap recently set up a foundation in the United States, and that's been a great kind of addition to the community, because now you have someone that is helping kind of, field proposals, coordinate between various DAO members and delegates, and ultimately, help kind of shepherd those proposals through. And yeah, I mean, I think that otherwise, right, you want to have in place what a growth strategy is. All of these things should really be put out into the community, and then you want, to kind of minimize the amount of ultimate coordination that is necessary, right? If you can kind of help people streamline the process of knowing where to go to, do snapshot voting, to put stuff on chain, all of that kind of helps rather than having to rely on people to kind of, help them. And that makes it, the more that you can empower individuals to act within the DAO, the better. So that's really it. I mean, I think that the general premise and the takeaway here, right, is that obviously building in Web3 is very, very different. The primary goal and kind of all of the things that I've talked about is increasing the overall decentralization of a system. Tokens are a way to help you achieve that. But if you don't have the proper corporate structure in place that actually, that defaults to decentralization, right? So having different multiple entities within a structure, you ultimately will default to centralization, right? I think in the things that we've seen within DAOs and within these organizations, right, is that without kind of a good foundation for decentralization, organizations tend to default to centralization. And so as a result of that, you need safeguards in place to ensure that decentralization can actually flourish, and that your system, even if you set it up very properly, right, won't ultimately just go back to a centralized kind of organization that then introduces a bunch of regulatory risks, as well as just undermining the actual value of Web3 technology. That's it.
I maybe have one to kick us off while others are thinking. Miles, I think a lot of the teams in here are maybe down the line thinking of decentralizing, but more immediately are themselves selling to DAOs.
Yeah.
And in the process of being counterparts to DAOs. So do you have any advice for teams in those positions, whether it's entering certain types of contracts, negotiating, how to protect themselves, and kind of make those good long-term relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fundamental issue with kind of entering into any business relationship with a DAO is if it doesn't have a legal entity form, then you have really no way of enforcing your rights against it. And one of the other things that we've seen with DAOs, right, is the anonymity makes people feel more comfortable being not like good faith, honest actors when they're in their business dealings. So there are a couple of examples of DAOs trying to like unwind investments that investors had made, just because the value had gone up. So I think what you want to do is prioritize ensuring that you actually have DAO approval before you enter into any relationship with the DAO, right? You want to see there either be on-chain approval or an off-chain approval to ensure that you actually have buy-in from the DAO community. And then, I think you want to protect yourself from underlying risks. One of the things that you can do to do that, right, is to find key delegates or strong, some of the leaders of the DAO, right, and try and enter into legal agreements specifically with them to ensure that you are actually contracting with someone. At the end of the day, any type of contractual relationship with the DAO is going to be inherently more risky than with a corporation, but that's kind of the nature of operating within Web3. Now, what I will say is that once we have these legal entity forms created in California and other states that we're working with, that would be another thing to prioritize, is encouraging DAOs to adopt those legal entity forms so that you can then contract with a legal entity.
My question is how this ideal framework interface with the existing sector regulatory framework, and whether there are any known limitations or how to think about that. So, for example, with Kiki, we have customer personal data. We also need to be FDI compliant because we have products that's a relatively light regulatory load. But if there's medical records or companies that are applying this set of governance structure, is that limiting, or are there any known limitation of setting out to do this vis-a-vis just being compliant?
Yeah, so regulatory compliance is, and let me go.
Is like just at the client level, so it's.
Yeah, so like one of the things that we have been talking to regulators about and to policymakers, right, is that fundamentally you don't want to apply regulatory compliance, right, at the smart contract level, because if you try to apply regulatory compliance there, you end up with a whole host of issues. These are supposed to be global protocols, right? So you don't how can they possibly comply with every single jurisdiction's regulatory requirements, right? At the end of the day, this layer is just software, and so rather than applying regulatory compliance at that layer, right, you should be applying it at this layer. And in that scenario, right, the DAO oversees this. So we don't want DAOs to be responsible for regulatory compliance, because ultimately that will unwind and really impede their ability to be decentralized. But if you're operating a client that taps into this software, right, this is where the regulatory compliance would be. So if you think about, for instance, just let's take Uniswap's protocol, right? If exchanges of digital assets end up being regulated, right, then what we would probably expect to see is that if you are running an application that uses Uniswap's protocol, right, you would be regulated, but the underlying protocol will not be regulated. And so that's a concept that we're really trying to push here in the US. It's somewhat kind of in flux right now with a couple regulatory actions, but there are jurisdictions like the UK who are very bought into kind of that dichotomy, and is something that we're going to continue to push for.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks so much for the talk. Feels like the military grade survival guide, and also congrats on the UNA work. It's really amazing. One question, how does the government view the binding between the UNA structure and the intentions of the token holders of the DAO? Because I would imagine somebody still needs to control the private key to deploy the upgrades to the protocol. And like, are there legal protections in the event that that is divergent between the two entities?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that we want to do, right, with the with the UNA structure, right, I think what I would argue is that if you do need to have some type of like off-chain, right, key management, generally speaking, right, I would prefer everyone move away from like multi-sigs and move towards governance that like actually like can be instituted on-chain. But to the extent that you have off-chain components, right, I think one of the things that we'll see and how we're going to kind of design these UNAs, right, is basically that you can have like an administrator, right, and that person's job is just to like have a contractual relationship with the DAO, and they will carry out the tasks that the DAO kind of says. So if you do need someone to deploy a smart contract upgrade or change a parameter or whatever, right, it would be that person that would be doing it. Now, the nice thing about that is that you would get the limited liability protection that entity structure would afford, which is the most critical part. But the nice thing, right, is that these UNA structures don't look anything like corporations. So like one of the entity forms that people have pursued or looked at, right? You've heard of Wyoming has a DAO bill, right? Utah has a DAO bill, Tennessee has a DAO bill. All of those DAO bills are LLCs, right? And there's an inherent problem with using an LLC. There's two. Historically, membership interests in LLCs have been treated as securities. And so as a result of that, you don't really want to use a structure where like, membership in that structure has historically been regulated as like a securities relationship, right? Second, there's a bill that passed in Congress a couple of years ago called the Corporate Transparency Act, and that basically necessitates that any organization in the US has to essentially be able to keep track of who their members are, right? Now, UNAs are excluded from that bill. And so as a result of that, you can imagine, right, it's not really possible for a DAO to be able to track the membership of hundreds of thousands of people, right, who are mostly anonymous. So as a result of that, right, the UNA affords kind of a lot of benefits that these other legal entity structures don't. And at the same time, though, it doesn't create it doesn't look like a C Corp. There are no owners of an UNA. They're just members. And again, the nonprofit kind of element of it means that you're not kind of treating it like equity. And so as a result of that, it is kind of the best structure that we have available. And so that's the one that we're, going to continue to pursue.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So last question, given that, and this is a little bit philosophical, but given that a lot of the interesting things that you would do with DAOs do require government enforcement for the off-chain stuff, what do you see as the fundamental value addition of blockchain technology versus just having an UNA that's administered through a server or anything else?
I guess what I would say, right, is that fundamentally the way that a corporate network is set up, right, is fundamentally incompatible with kind of the way that you want to set up a blockchain network, right? So if you were to set up a C Corp and create a corporate network, right, it's all about, again, maximizing value for your shareholders, right? That's what you're legally bound to do as an officer or director of a C Corp. And as a result of that, when you go to launch a corporate network, right, the way that you should be setting that up is to maximize the value for shareholders. So the network effects in that kind of scenario have to accrue to the company so that they then benefit the shareholders, right? The whole idea behind using different entity structures in Web3, right, is to escape that kind of reality, right, which isn't conducive to stakeholder capitalism, which is open networks where the benefits actually accrue to users, right? And so what the UNA structure does is allows you to basically move away from a corporate structure, lets you design systems that benefit all users. Now, I think it's a good question, right, whether or not decentralized governance is even necessary, and Porter will get into talking about governance and kind of what works and what doesn't. But I
definitely think it's necessary. Yeah, I was more so saying like, why not just have the UNA without the smart contract?
Oh, okay. So you mean instead of on-chain governance?
Yeah.
Right. I think that you could do that, right? I think that there are benefits to having on-chain governance, right? In the sense that I think it does reduce some amount of trust, but it also, without on-chain governance, and there are problems with people voting, right? So for instance, like we hold our tokens with a lot of with qualified custodians, and so it's difficult for us to engage in kind of snapshot voting. Like, so there's just all of these things that basically, I think in an ideal world, everything would be on chain, and that would work well enough that it like wasn't super costly, and that, you know, and all those prices would drive down. So I think, you know, if you're doing stuff off chain, there's just inherently more trust involved, and so I think if we can limit trust to the extent possible, right, that would ultimately be the goal.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for the talk. My question's a bit more about like doomsday scenarios or like worst case situations if like the foundation or the dev corp can go rogue. So you talked a lot about like decentralization and like ensuring a lot of like governance and things are codified as being checks and balances. But in my mind, especially for the treasury side of things where you're giving tokens to these entities, like even with lockups or like time delays, they could still just spend like in ways that aren't in line with what the DAO wants. So
that's absolutely, yeah, no, I mean, that's 100% right. And I think that that's fundamentally what like people in the Arbitrum case had a problem with, right? Is that like they were giving this massive grant to the foundation with no real parameters around how the foundation then spent those tokens, right? And so like that, and that's a fundamental, you know, that's a lot of power to give an organization that doesn't have any checks and balances on it, right? I think that what I would say is that there's some inherent benefit to not having checks and balances over the foundation, in the sense that they can really then act as a conflicting, like they can have conflicting views with the dev corp, right, and with the DAO, and that overall like increases decentralization. I think conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, if they just enrich themselves, right, that is obviously very problematic, but they do have fiduciary duties that are associated with the mission of the foundation, right? And they have to kind of carry through the foundation. Now, they might see it a different way, but that's, you know, ultimately the risk that you take with decentralization is that people go in different directions. Like, I mean, and that's true in every decentralized organization, right? It's true of the United States government, right? I mean, at the end of the day, right, having kind of decentralized actors that are you know, have their own power leads to potential benefits as well as negatives.
And then really quick on like the treasury side of it specifically, do you think it's good to have like some form of like direct connection between the DAO and the foundation beyond like just time-gated like delays for treasury or tokens to be unlocked? So something as simple as like the foundation can always spend this money when like there's been sub-snapshot vote or like other DAO decision.
Yeah, I think you can do that pretty easily, right? So I think that you can set it up so that if you give the foundation a grant of tokens to then, you know, use as an ecosystem fund to grant to other developers, that you can put parameters around it that require DAO approval, right? So you could say, look, you get 100 tokens, you know, 25, like every 25 we have to approve, right? So the 75 are locked at first, you get 25. And then you could also put parameters around like, these are the types of protocols that have to be, you know, or the type of development that we want. And like the furthest would be that you actually give the DAO approval rights over the grants that are being made by the foundation, right? But it's still, you would keep the separation in place where you can't just kind of, the DAO can't just control the foundation by replacing board members.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Miles. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question around how you can basically set up the foundation.
Yeah.
And like how to think about it as like, you know, we're like dev corp right now and you're building the culture. So should we think of it as like, that's like the board of directors that are as independent as possible in terms of they represent maybe all the stakeholders, or yeah, or if you have examples maybe from existing companies like Compound and Uniswap, did the teams move to foundation?
Sure.
Or
yeah. So I mean, I think that the best, you know, Optimism did a really good job. Uniswap did a good job. They, you know, they ended up being able to get a couple people that came out of the Ethereum Foundation to come into their foundation and basically run it. And it's mostly like, it's kind of part grant program, part, you know, kind of community management around kind of the proposals that come through. So I think that's really good. I would say that the number one challenge that people face, right, is getting people moved into the foundation that are actually going to do work, right? So I think like the kind of easiest pathway to setting up the foundation is you create the foundation in the Cayman Islands, and then you hire a bunch of professional directors, right? So these are people that basically live in the Cayman Islands, and like their job is to serve as director of these foundations. Now you can see like that's like the quality that you're getting out of that is inherently not going to be someone that is like going to fully understand your protocol, be totally mission aligned in terms of trying to grow the ecosystem. So there's inherent like problems with that approach, and that the quality you're getting is just not probably good enough to really make the foundation meaningful. And so I think a founder moving from the developer corporation to the foundation and kind of severing their relationship with the dev corp is a really good idea. Obviously, some founders don't want to do that, but like that is the kind of pathway that we've seen the most success in, because it's the only, you basically move someone that is very motivated, very driven to kind of make the foundation a real instrument of decentralization, and that's been the most successful kind of pathway we've seen, but obviously it's also the one that's the hardest.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Miles.
All
That was
right.
great.
Thanks all.